Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Urozhaine, where the Russians continue their third battle of Urozhaine. The Russians over the past few days have managed to push in to expand their foothold and gain an additional foothold here in the southern parts of the village. This offensive operation will likely be combined with an attack on Staromayorsk. If we take a look here at the topographic map, we can see any attack on Staromayorsk will come from the west, from the high ground, where the elevation of the Russian positions are 168 meters compared to 116, so a 50-meter advantage. By Urozhaine, we're seeing the attacks taking place from the southern parts, gaining a foothold at the 130-meter mark, allowed them then to push and take control over the entire area in the low grounds with about a 15-meter advantage. We may also see some Russian pushes from the east towards Urozhaine, here from the high ground positions they have east of the village. We see both here in the direction of Urozhaine and Staromayorsk, the Russians have positions in the high ground and will likely attack from those positions. If we take a closer look, we see here in the direction of Staromayorsk, there are a few first lines the Russians have to go through before they actually reach Staromayorsk. Here to the southwest, they already have a foothold within this forest line here, so they may look to gain control of this before moving on to the next one, gaining control of that, and then storming Staromayorsk itself. In the east by Urozhaine, we see here to the northwestern positions of the Russian positions east of Urozhaine. They have access to this road here that connects to Urozhaine from the east, and there's the fortifications of the Ukrainians here to the north. The Russians tried to hold on to these positions for a very long time during the Ukrainian counterattack. However, in the end, the Ukrainians managed to capture it, and this has made it difficult for the Russians to recapture Urozhaine and force them to attack from the south. So it is likely that the Russians will push through from the eastern parts by gaining control over these positions here to the east of Urozhaine before pushing in a western direction and assisting the Russian assault on Urozhaine from the east and from the high grounds. So both Urozhaine and Staromayorsk are likely to be under attack in the coming days and weeks until the Russians capture them by using the high ground advantage they have in the area. Taking a look at the next section of the front line, we see here to the north of Urozhaine, the Russians have advanced northeast of Arkhangelsk, where the Russians have managed to push through, capture some Ukrainian fortifications and forest lines here to the northeast of the village. This is to push on to the next set of Ukrainian fortifications to expand the zone of control north of Kharkiv, gaining a buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian positions, and to flank the Ukrainian positions here by Arkhangelsk, bypassing the Ukrainian fortifications and fortified areas to hit Arkhangelsk from a undefended point. But we do see here to the north of Arkhangelsk, there's this river line here, and on the other side of it, the Ukrainian side of it, there is an elevation advantage for the Ukrainians, and we do see that there are fortifications there as well. So we're seeing the Russians are actually fighting through the western parts of Arkhangelsk towards the forest line here next to the fortifications, and they're pushing in a northeastern direction at the northwestern outskirts of the front line. They're here attempting to bypass the Ukrainian advantages by the lake by pushing through from the fields and roads connected to that point. At the same time, fighting is taking place by the fortifications here to the east and south of Novoalexandrivka. The Russians are here fighting to improve their positions and push the Ukrainians away, while at the same time gaining the most advantage possible, while preventing the Ukrainians from making use of their height advantage and their fortifications advantage by heavily bombarding them and attacking from better positions instead of the worst positions. Based on this, we see that the Russians continue advancing across the front, in specifically the direction of the north of Donetsk/Avdiivka and here by Urozhaine. So all of this, how is this connected with the upcoming Russian offensive? We see multiple points that points towards a Russian upcoming offensive taking place, and there are multiple articles we have to take a look at that supplements the possibility of a Russian offensive. But first off, we have this rail connection that the Russians are building in the south, in between Rostov-on-Don and Sevastopol. Based on this map here, we see the Russians use multiple new rail connections here, all the way from Rostov towards Mariupol, through Berdyansk to Melitopol, and then down south to Crimea through Simferopol and Sevastopol. At the same time, there is the rail connection between Rostov and Kerch in the south. Then in the northern parts, there's also connections between Mariupol and Donetsk. And this connection between Mariupol and Donetsk was used for the first time today with this video here, showing a Russian train between Mariupol and Volnovakha, which is here to the south of Donetsk, where there is connection between Mariupol to Volnovakha to Donetsk. So with this, the rail connection being built and finished here in the direction of the front line allows the Russians to significantly improve their supply situation. If this rail connection completely finishes, or there's an additional rail connection to Sevastopol, then any destruction of the Kerch Bridge would be nothing but symbolic for the Ukrainians and would have no impact on the supply coming and going from and to Crimea. At the same time, it will significantly improve the supply situation in the entire south, allowing the Russians to launch offensive operations with this improved supply situation. So we see that the supply situation improving significantly increases the possibility of a Russian offensive in the south. As for the east, there are these articles here. The first one here is of the Ukrainian general and commander of the Ukrainian ground forces. Talks about three different things: the Russian advantage, the upcoming Russian offensive, and how he believes Ukraine can win the war. The first one is the Russian advantage. He says that the Russians now have a 10-to-1 firepower advantage when it comes to including both artillery and the air force. This gives the Russians a significant advantage. At the same time, he claims that drones are now killing more soldiers on both sides than anything else, which is why it is impossible to create a large strike force. However, this is a flawed conclusion. The difference between the drones and artillery/air force is that drones are used for smaller units, while artillery and air force are used for larger units. His statement is that the small assault groups that we have seen since the Ukrainian summer offensive are now useless because of the drones. However, launching an attack with, for example, a brigade-sized unit or a division-sized unit would be much more beneficial to the attacking side, and either side really, to defeat drones, because the more firepower you have available, the easier it is to detect and shoot down the drones. And at the same time, if there is a large swarm of drones, they would be able to hit a battalion-sized or company-sized unit, but they would not be able to completely hit a brigade or division-sized. And this is where it comes back to the point I made in a previous analysis video, which is that if you have a large enough force today, you can push through either side's defenses. You'll have a break of the front line where you then outrun the Ukrainian or Russian drone operators who are stationed between 5 and 10 kilometers from the front line. And at that point, the other side will be having a very difficult time to launch additional drones. And in the end, a large sized unit would be more beneficial than one of these smaller sized units. Finally, he talks about the upcoming Russian offensive, where he says that the Russians will be looking to gain full control over the Donbass before they move on to Zaporizhzhia. He does not talk about Kharkiv or Sumy in this article. He does finally say that the only possibility that the Ukrainians have of winning is to isolate Russia and to increase the technological advantage of Ukraine to be above that of Russia and mostly focused around drones. Now, this article with a senior general of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, deputy head of the main intelligence directorate, Skibitsky, he says that the current frontline situation is harder now than ever, and the only possibility of this war ending is by negotiations. Basically, he's saying that the Ukrainians cannot win and cannot recapture the territory that they want to recapture. Chasiv Yar will fall like Avdiivka, it's only a matter of time. But most importantly, he talks about the upcoming Russian offensive. He says that the Russians are preparing for an offensive around the Kharkiv and Sumy regions in the northeast. The Russian group on the border with Kharkiv numbers 35,000 troops, but they plan to increase it to 50 to 70,000 troops. The Russian offensive will begin in late May, early June. Now the Russian armed forces act as a single body with a clear plan and under a single command. This is the result of the reorganization that I have talked about previously. The Russians started a reorganization with the mobilization of its troops in October of 2022. It continued for over a year, this reorganization, and it has recently finished, where the Russians have a common command structure and a single command with a clear plan, clear strategy that is, as he says, acts as a single body. So this has significantly improved the Russian capabilities to command a large-scale army compared to at the start of the war, where each army group pretty much acted on its own. We have seen previous estimates by the Ukrainian side and Western side where they estimate how many troops the Russians are going to gather. They usually shoot under what is expected. For example, prior to the Russian invasion in 2022, the Ukrainians and the Western powers expected about 120,000 Russian soldiers, but in the end, the estimates ran up to 150 to 200,000 soldiers. Finally, there is this article here by Business Insider. The US spent so much time fighting insurgents that it forgot what it means to actually fight a war, a US veteran in Ukraine says. In this article, he talks about how through his fighting and experience in the fighting and training in the United States, it's mainly focused around guerrilla warfare, while the fighting and the war here in Russia and Ukraine is completely different. The United States soldiers, he says, are way too experienced with having the advantage, and not just having the advantage, having a significant advantage in equipment and manpower. But against Russia in Ukraine, he has spent a lot more time fighting at a disadvantage compared to the other side. So he's saying that the United States soldiers that are being trained and not being sent to their battles, to their bases, do not have the necessary expectations and experience fighting at a disadvantage or even at a leveled advantage where either side could come out on top. It is instead that the Russians have an advantage. The United States could fight a battle where they are equal or have a slight advantage. The United States soldiers are not trained for that, and they do not have the correct mindset for that. We'll have to see if the United States edits their training segments and their army structure, which, according to information I've received from some leaked information insiders, they are working on. They are working on reorganizing their army to larger structures and completely changing up their strategy, but more on that at a later date. That is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.